Hello, Columbus State students. This video will provide you with some additional helpful hints when coding for ICD-10-CM diagnoses. In the previous video, How to Navigate the ICD-10-CM Coding Manual, you learned the basic steps to finding a CM diagnosis code. Number one, identify the main term in the alphabetic index and then also identify any subterms that are listed in the medical documentation. Number two, verify the code in the tabular list. It's always important to remember the ACT rule. ACT, always check the tabular. You should never, ever, ever stop coding in the alphabetic index. And number three, assign the correct code after checking the tabular list for any instructional notes or mentions of additional character assignment. For this first helpful hint, we will need to think back to the CM coding guidelines and conventions and remember the role of parentheses. Parentheses alert the coder to non-essential modifiers. These modifying terms are just as the title indicates. They are not essential to the code assignment. So let's take a look at the main term strabismus in the alphabetic index of your CM coding book. Remember from your medical terminology course that strabismus means cross-eyed or a wandering eye diagnosis. So after the main term listing of strabismus, we find two non-essential modifiers, congenital and non-paralytic. This means that these descriptive terms, congenital and non-paralytic, are not essential to the strabismus diagnosis. This means that within any medical documentation that the coder is looking at, you could see strabismus documented, you could see congenital strabismus documented, you could see non-paralytic strabismus documented. Any of these are going to be coded to H50.9. So this code would be assigned whether or not these terms were included in the documentation or not. They are non-essential. Now let's discuss some more the importance of the ACT rule. Always check the tabular. To demonstrate this rule, let's look at both the alphabetic index and the tabular list for the diagnosis of second-degree burn left palm. Beginning in the alphabetic index, we begin with the main term burn. Note all of these non-essential modifiers here. Main term burn, subterms palm, left, second degree. This leads us to code T23.252. But we do have this boxed check mark next to the code. So what does this boxed check mark mean? Well, at the bottom of every single page of the alphabetic index, there is a reminder note. And it tells us that this check mark means that an additional character is required. Refer to the tabular list for character selection. So this is just a reminder that the code book is giving you to check the tabular list for additional characters that may need to be added to this code. Code 23.252 is not a valid code by itself. Now let's take a look at the tabular list for the code T23.252 that we found from the alphabetic index. So now we're in the back of the book in the tabular. Please note that there is a little reminder box here too where it says check mark 7th. This tells us again that code T23252 is not a valid code. We need to pull in a 7th character. So note that usually when you're asked to find, say, a 4th character or a 5th character to make your code valid, it's usually listed as a subterm here in the tabular list. But sometimes when we need to pull in a 7th character, often for burns and injuries, we need to make sure we're looking at the entire category. So remember, the category of a CM code is the first 3 characters, T23. So when we scroll up in the tabular list and come to category T23, you note this pink box. The appropriate 7th character is to be added to each code from category T23. So we're getting lots of reminders. The alphabetic index is telling us to check for an additional character. The code in the tabular list is telling us to pull in a 7th character to make this a valid code. And when we look in entirety at the category, it's telling us to pull in the 7th character for any code within this category. So in this instance, the final code would be T23.252, and then we would pull in A as the 7th character initial encounter. This just means this was the first trip to see the physician about this particular burn of the left palm. There was no medical documentation stating that this was a follow-up or subsequent encounter for the burn, and it does not mention the fact that the patient is being seen for a sequela or a late effect of the burn. So we can deduce that this was the initial encounter for this diagnosis. While we are on this slide, let's go ahead and take into consideration another diagnosis entirely. So we're finished with this one. We found our correct code for this diagnosis. Let's consider something else, this T30 category. So let's say the documentation was just very vague and it just said patient was being seen for a burn. So when we go to the alphabetic index, we find burn. We have no other specificity. Again, remember we have these non-essential modifiers. So if the documentation said thermal burn or just burn or steam burn, they would all be coded to T30.0. Now when we go find this in the tabular list, note there was no check mark here in the alphabetic index, and there's no note here in the tabular list. So we know we're okay here with these 4 characters. But even though the alphabetic index did not tell us to find additional characters, we still need to follow the ACT rule. So even though we have all of the characters coming directly from that alphabetic index, please note that there are also some notes here to take into consideration, such as this code is not for inpatient use. Again, always check the tabular. Whether you have the check mark and need additional characters or not, always go check the tabular for those instructional notes. Let's think about some other helpful hints regarding that ACT rule. Thinking back again to those coding guidelines and conventions, remember terms such as includes, exclude 1, which means not coded here. Excludes 2, not included here. Code also and code first. Remember that all of those convention and guidelines, again, this is just a sampling, but all of those conventions and guidelines are always with you for reference in the front of your code book. So just make sure you remember that they're there for your reference. Now, let's take a look at an example from, again, we're going to be in the tabular list here. So looking at code E11 for type 2 diabetes mellitus. Note that we have an includes note. So let's say the medical documentation just documented diabetes. It didn't specify whether it was type 1 or type 2. If there was just a diagnosis of diabetes written, it's telling us that that is included in this type 2 code. So if the documentation just said diabetes, we would still code to E11 category. There are also some other notes here, such as use additional code to identify control using. So if we had a type 2 diabetic who was on insulin, we would, in addition to coding the E11 for the type 2 diabetes, we would also pull in the Z79.4 code for the insulin use. And then we also have an excludes one note here, meaning not coded here. So if there was a diagnosis of, let's say, neonatal diabetes mellitus, and within the alphabetic index you found your way to code E11, this is telling you, hey, excludes one, neonatal diabetes mellitus is not coded as E11. Instead, it is coded as P70.2. So again, the importance of those instructional notes and checking the tabular list. Let's go ahead and take one other look at an example from the tabular list, this time for sleep apnea, G47.3. So let's say in the alphabetic index you found your way to G47.3. We've got this reminder here saying, hey, these 4 characters are not valid as a code. You must pull in a 5th character. So here we go, looking underneath G47.3 and pulling anything that is specified. So if you just had sleep apnea, not otherwise specified or unspecified, this would be the correct code. Or if it was obstructive sleep apnea, this would be the correct code. So again, we've got the reminder here, this is not valid. We must find a 5th character that matches up to our documentation. Also note that there is a code also note here for any of these G47.3 codes. Code also any associated underlying condition. So perhaps the patient has, COPD, also documented as an associated underlying condition by the physician. We would code not only the G47 code, but we would also need to pull in that COPD code as well. We also have an excludes one note here. So if there was sleep apnea of a newborn documented, again, that's not going to be coded at G47. It's going to be coded to P28.3. So again, just showing you the importance of checking that tabular list. Now, we have reviewed the concept of placeholder X previously, but it never hurts just to look at one more example here. So again, we're here in the tabular list. So let's pretend we've already looked up our diagnosis in the alphabetic index, and it's sending us to code T58.01, toxic effect of carbon monoxide from motor vehicle exhaust, accidental, unintentional. Here we have some reminder boxes next to the code, and this is telling us check has X 7th character. This is telling us we have 5 characters here, right? We could never stop at T58.0 because it's telling us we need a 5th character. We have our 5th character in the 0.01, but this note is telling us, hey, you need a 7th character. There are only 5 here. We have this X noted telling you you're going to need a placeholder, okay? So the final code here would be T58.01. Here we have 5 characters. We need to pull in the 7th character from our category. 7th character, let's go with initial encounter again. But here we only have 5 characters. We need a 6th character, placeholder X, so that we are able to put the A in the appropriate position as the 7th character. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. For the sake of discussion, as we're looking at this placeholder X concept, please note that sometimes you may have more than one placeholder X. So let's imagine you went to the tabular list and it gave you 4 characters. So I'm just going to make one up here. Let's say it led you to G43.2, but there was a note over here, X 7th, that we needed a 7th character. We only have 4, so our final code, if it's telling us in the reminder box that we need that 7th character, G43.2, so we're at 4 characters, 5, 6, and then the 7th character A in that 7th position. So just know again, you may have more than one placeholder X. That is a possibility. Hopefully, these helpful hints have opened your eyes to a few more considerations while coding. Again, that code book does a nice job of giving you reminders. You just have to remember to look for them. So good luck with your coding this week, and be sure to send me an email or post to the Coding Roundtable if you have any questions.